Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it's an honor to be here at the Drucker Global Forum. Co-locating trading servers, repo 105s, and earnings management, these are but 3 examples of gaming the modern capital markets game. In each case, the rules of the game are followed. There's no rule that says the NYSE can't rent out space in its facility to hardwire traders directly to its servers. There are rules about Repo 105 transactions, and according to the finest auditors and lawyers on the planet, Lehman was following those rules, and allowing CEOs to make forward-looking statements that cause analysts to adjust their earnings estimates in a way that CEOs prefer, that too is perfectly legitimate and condoned explicitly by the safe harbor provision of US law. So what is the concern here? The fundamental problem is this kind of gaming threatens the underlying game. The underlying game here is business, and it is truly an important game. Business is a game in which companies supply real and valued products or services to customers. Business is the game that generates value for customers, jobs for employees, and returns for investors. Done well, it creates net wealth and prosperity for society. The functioning of this game is central to the well-being and prosperity, or lack thereof, of every country on the planet. The capital markets are a vital component of this game. In order to grow and thrive, companies need capital. Investors are the source of that capital, and much modern investment is made through our public capital markets, and for equity capital, through the stock exchanges in particular. So for this game to work, 2 pillars must work in tandem: businesses and the capital markets that finance them. Threats to either pillar threaten the game. The game is threatened if businesses, aided and abetted by prominent auditors and lawyers, hide mountains of debt from investors using obscure accounting provisions. It is threatened if stock analysts are manipulated by CEOs using the safe harbor provision, and if CEOs spend more time shaping analyst expectations than running their business. It's threatened by unequal access, in which some firms have preferential and tangible speed advantages over others in the zero-sum game of stock trading. These techniques may be profitable and enjoyable for the gamers, the high-frequency traders, the hedge funds, the stock-compensated CEOs, but they cannot exist without the underlying game. Yet these gamers parasitically feed off the game of business. They seem blissfully unaware that if they destroy that game, they'll destroy themselves too. True, there always has and always will be gaming. It's part of the cycle of innovation. But there's a huge difference between a situation in which a clever trader generates and takes advantage of proprietary information related to a single event and the systematic use of an advantage by a special group of traders for every single transaction on every single day. The same folks argue that there have always been incidents of aggressive accounting that may cross the line into fraudulent accounting, but contemplate the recent escalation in scale and scope. Waste Management's cumulative misstatement between 1992 and 1997 broke the billion-dollar fraud barrier for the first time ever. And following that, in quick succession, were the multi-billion-dollar accounting frauds at Enron, Adelphia, Global Crossing, Quest, Tyco, WorldCom, Royal Ahol, and Parmalat. Despite the passage of Sarbanes-Oxley, multi-billion-dollar fraud proceeds apace, including the aforementioned Lehman Brothers. Finally, some folks argue to me that CEOs have always manipulated earnings to improve their personal compensation. Indeed, I'm sure they have. But prior to 1980, there was close to zero stock-based compensation for CEOs, and the incentive to manipulate earnings was tiny compared to the incentive in the post-1980 period, when stock-based compensation burgeoned. Suddenly, earnings manipulation had potentially huge payoffs. How widespread is earnings manipulation? For a 2005 article, finance professors John Graham, Campbell Harvey, and Shiva Ragapal surveyed 400 financial executives from large US public companies and found that a majority of them, 75% of them in fact, agreed that in order to meet the current quarter's analyst consensus earnings, they would defer or cancel entirely attractive projects. The effects of earnings manipulation are real, and they are growing. So all games need rules, including economic games like trading, accounting, and compensation. The prevailing view of our economic game seems to be, so long as we have rules and we enforce them, the game will be just fine. But gaming is not a stable phenomenon. It's a dynamic, self-reinforcing system. Clever innovators figure out an initial way to game the game, then everybody watching replicates the gambit, eliminating the initial advantage. So the cleverest gamers realize that they have to take their gaming to the next level. This is eventually matched, which produces the next level of gaming, and so on. That's how we get 70% share for high-frequency trade and billions of dollars spent on ultra-high-speed networks. It is how we not get the occasional repurchase agreement, but $50 billion of Repo 105s for a single company. And it's how leading companies can manage earnings and analysts to get the utterly unnatural results. And the more important the game, the more dedicated the gamers. And the capital markets have become by far the biggest economic game in the world. For that reason, the most motivated gamers are focused on it. And they're succeeding. The biggest gamers in the world are hedge fund managers, and they've quickly become the most potent economic force in America. I would argue that rules alone don't protect a game, even if they're rigorously enforced. A fixed set of rules won't stop the gamers from gaming because the world changes and games evolve. A rigid adherence to a single unchanging set of rules by some players simply offers more power to those inclined to game the game. It is almost enough to make one give up on rules entirely, but in a free market, or a market free-for-all is clearly not the answer. The only solution is to accept that the game you love will always be gamed by the most dedicated, talented, and ruthless gamers. So don't attempt to set, maintain, and enforce the perfect set of rules. Rather, adjust them continuously to counteract the gaming. The key is not the rules themselves, but the principles that guide the continuous adjustment of the rules. Regular tweaking of the rules is critical to success, but the question is how to tweak. The tweaking needs to be guided at all times by an unwavering set of principles. As the rules evolve, the principles must remain steadfast. When it comes to banking, Canada shares many similarities with the US. But in the wake of the 2008 financial sector meltdown, not a single Canadian bank required government bailout, not even close. While vast swaths of the US banking system required massive government intervention and taxpayer resources, as well as banks in the UK and Europe. Given the structural similarities, why the massive difference in outcomes? In Canada, there were rules, but more important, there were principles. A central figure in applying the principles was Julie Dixon, the superintendent of the Office of the Superintendent of Financial Institutions, called OSFI. Instead of operating strictly by the proverbial book, Dixon met regularly with the leadership of the Canadian banks, and when she saw something that they were doing that was just plain silly, she told them to stop it, whether or not it was within the rules. Canadian banks didn't avoid the fate of the US banks because of rules, they avoided it because of principles. So what are the principles that should guide us in protecting and enhancing modern democratic capitalism? I do not propose to have the full answer. This is a project to which I and others will be turning in earnest in the next few years. But to get the thinking started, I'd offer 4 principles helpfully supported by the greatest management thinker of the past century, Peter Drucker. First, I believe that if we hold the principle that the customer comes first, we will be more likely to nurture healthier economic games that produce greater societal value. Putting the fans first has helped the owners and players succeed in the NFL. If the fans are happy, the owners will do well. It does not work so well the other way around. Yet in the capital markets, we've increasingly put investors first. The capital markets are merely an aggregation of individual companies who trade on stock exchanges. And at the individual company level, it may seem at first blush that putting shareholder value first would be best for shareholders. It is not. Putting customers first is the best way for shareholders of individual companies to prosper. In the long run, investors are best off when companies grow and succeed, and that's what maximizes stock values. If we focus on making the stock markets work wonderfully for investors, rather than on helping companies raise equity, manage their operations, serve their customers for the long haul, investors will actually suffer. Artifacts like mandatory quarterly reporting and incredibly complicated and legalistic requirements for issuing treasury stock may seem sensible, if not optimal, if investors come first, but if instead issuers come first as the true customers of stock markets, I believe we would be better off. Putting customers first, of course, is not new. Peter Drucker said 60 years ago that the purpose of a company is to create a customer. Then it may have been a novel and controversial idea, but it shouldn't be anymore. Second, I believe that if we seek integrative solutions on principle, we will be more likely to prosper. Currently, integrative thinking is not the core principle of the modern world or capitalism or capital markets. Our world operates instead on the principle that deep and narrow specialization is the most important capability to pursue and value. As long as that is the case, we'll produce narrow answers that don't take advantage of the understanding of the whole. Since the world is complex and interrelated, we build simplified models of it in order to function. Nowhere do we do that more than the capital markets. Yet when we operate it on the basis of these narrow models, avoiding complexity, we get into trouble. The less integrative our thinking, the more capital markets crashes we will produce, as in 2008, on the basis of financial models that look at only pieces of the true financial picture. The more integrative our thinking, the more our models will be consistent with the way the world actually works, and the better chance they will produce results that we actually need and want. Again, this is not new. Peter Drucker has long said this to be the case, and said so in addressing an audience at the Rotman School in 2002. He said, "There are no tax problems, there are only business problems. There are no marketing decisions, there are only business decisions. There are no specialty results, there are only business results." Third, we should hold as a principle that we seek sustainability. If instead, as was the case leading up to the financial crisis, the principle is that we should do whatever is doable until the music stops, we will get utterly unsustainable games, like the subprime mortgage bubble, that crash spectacularly. Similarly, if companies believe that they needn't be concerned with environmental sustainability and aren't required by the capital markets to pay attention to it, company performance will only prosper until such time as the ecology collapses, taking business with it. Once again, Peter Drucker was decades ahead of his time on the sustainability front, arguing famously in 1954 that what is most important is that management realize it must consider the impact of business policy and business action upon society. It has to consider whether the action is likely to promote the public good and to advance the beliefs of our society to contribute to its stability, strength, and harmony. Fourth and finally, we should hold the principle that we support positive-sum games and discourage zero-sum games. Unfortunately, lots of the opposite goes on, as is the case with private equity taxation. The largest form of private equity, hedge fund management, is entirely a zero-sum game. Hedge fund managers trade financial instruments, and when they make a dollar, somebody else automatically loses a dollar. They add zero net value to society. Yet the carried interest that they earn as a fee for trading on behalf of their limited partner investors is taxed at the highly preferential capital gains rate. This represents the use of the tax system to encourage rather than discourage a large and rapidly growing zero-sum game. Meanwhile, income earned by executives who build companies is taxed at a much higher ordinary income tax rate, which discourages the positive-sum game of growing a real company. Modern capitalism is increasingly being dominated by the trading of value rather than the building of value. Much, if not all, of the trading creates no value for society. We need to ensure that zero-sum trading is not favored by our rules, but rather discouraged. When rules are altered, one core principle behind the alteration needs to be the encouragement of positive-sum gains. Thank you very much.